Well, welcome everyone, those of you who are here in this room and those who are online to the 2025 Zeman Lecture. I'm Carol Ann Jansen. I'm the chair of the Acadia Centre for Baptist and Anabaptist Studies, and I'm standing in for our director, Dr. Melody Maxwell, who is on sabbatical this term. The Center for ACBAS, as we call it, is one of the centers of excellence here at Acadia University. It was founded in 1991 jointly between the Faculty of Theology, the school here, and the library of Acadia University, the Vaughan Memorial Library. And it was founded by Dr. Yarrow Zeman, in whose honor this lecture is named. The lectures that we give alternate annually between the Zeman Lecture, which focuses on Anabaptist studies, alternatively with the George Rawlick Lecture, which focuses on Baptist studies. This year, we're also pleased to welcome Dr. Janice Zeman, who teaches at William and Mary, and she's on sabbatical as well, so she's one of Dr. Zeman's children. So it's just that lovely sort of organic connection that still exists. So we're especially welcoming you, Janice. I have some instructions for those of you who are online. On the website, you will see the chat box, and that's for the Q&A. If you want to comment or ask questions, that's where you will find it. I mean, we are streaming on various of our social media channels, but the chat is available on the website. And after the lecture is over today, it will be posted online for those of you who miss it today. We'll also have some refreshments afterwards, and they're just out in the corridor to the left. I'm now going to invite Dr. Michael Dennis, who is the professor of American History in the Department of History and Classics here at Acadia University, to introduce our guest and also to chair our Q&A afterwards.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Driedger, a friend of mine from grad school and a very accomplished scholar, as you can tell. He is an associate professor of history at Brock University in Canada's Niagara region. He has taught there since 2000. He has degrees in history from UBC, Queen's University, and is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Mannheim in Germany. He is a specialist in the history of early and modern Dutch and German Anabaptizing Protestants, labeled as Anabaptists. Previously, he has published on Mennonite exile communities in Hamburg and Krefeld. And between 2015 and 2023, he was a co-investigator on the Schurk-funded project Amsterdamified, great title, religious centers, spiritualist ideas, and urban associationalism in the emergence of the early Enlightenment in England and the Low Countries, 1540 to 1700. His main monograph, Obedient Heretics, 2002, explored the 17th century Mennonite tendency to mitigate their religious nonconformity by emphasizing their conformity to the political status quo. Anabaptist political radicalism is also a subject of his research. He has co-authored a book with James Stayer, former Zeman lecturer and Queen's University professor, contemporary of ours, and William Backer about the violent, complicated, and contested urban Reformation in Munster, and co-edited several volumes of essays on Anabaptist Mennonite history and related subjects. Another theme of his past research is about Mennonite preachers who supported democratic rights and the overthrow of aristocratic tyranny in the era of the French Revolution. His ongoing research is about the relationship between the Radical Reformation and the Radical Enlightenment, particularly the activities of Mennonite publishers, philosophers, and political activists in the Dutch Republic. He has published prolifically in these fields, including articles such as Against the Radical Reformation, on the continuity between early modern heresy-making and modern historiography, Munster, Monster, Modernity, tracing and challenging the meme of Anabaptist madness, Mennonites, gender, and the rise of civil society in the Dutch Enlightenment, and most recently, the year 1625, the Dutch Republic in Book History, Perspectives for Reframing Studies of Mennonites in Early Modernity. Dr. Driedger is the recipient of numerous scholarly grants and awards, including 4 Shirk grants and an appointment as Senior Research Fellow at the Leibniz Institute for European History in Mainz, Germany. And a fun fact is that his middle name is Dennis, which made for endless hilarity, of course, back in Queens, because I'm Michael Dennis, and he's Michael Dennis Driedger, and so a lot of fun with that. Let me just sort of just extemporize for a moment, saying that Mike Driedger was a rising star at Queens. Everyone knew that, and everyone admired him for that, and his star has continued to rise, frankly. So please welcome Dr. Michael Driedger, who will deliver a lecture titled The Year 1525, the Invention of Anabaptism, Cultural Narratives about Mennonites' Reformations. Mike, over.
Mike, thank you. I brought a fascinator along to distract your attention from my speaking. I will get to it in just a moment. This is going against advice from my communications associate and coach, but I will come to explain the hat in just a moment. But apropos rising star, well, right back at you, Mr. Dennis, and I would like to say a big thank you, to Carol Ann, to the community here at the Acadia Centre. I'm really honored to be speaking here, to be your guest for a number of reasons. I have heard so much about the Centre over the years from people such as my good friend and colleague Gary Waite, who I believe is watching, so hello, and Nina Schrader van der Schip, perhaps also watching online from the Netherlands. So greetings to you here, greetings to you online if you're able to watch. And I also want to say a special thank you to the organizers of the event, because I also organize a large lecture yearly for the history department at Brock University, and I know it's a lot of detail. So to the administrative team, to the academic team, to the technical team, a big hats off. And I also want to start by talking about something big. My theme today is the year 1525, and for Mennonites and for Marxists, that's a big year. I'll get to that Mennonite and Marxist connection in just a moment, but I want to think with you out loud for a moment about history, about storytelling, and about anniversaries. If we were to think about the year 2025 in terms of anniversary years, what could we do? Well, among the other anniversaries, it is the 25th anniversary of the passing of Gerald Zeman, who I never got a chance to meet. I know his work through reading, but also through the introduction that James Stayer gave to his work here in this series, maybe at this podium, years ago, 11 years ago, I think, in 2014. And it's a wonderful introduction to Gerald Zeman's work. So I'd like to recommend that to anybody in the audience, online or here, if you're interested to learn more about Gerald Zeman's scholarship, and also learn about Jim Stayer. 2025, it could also be the year that George Rollack turned 90, if he had lived so long. He was born in 1935 and passed away too young. And, well, what else could this year be, 2025? It is the anniversary of James Stayer's 90th birthday, which was on the Ides of March, up on the whiteboard. March 15th, 2025, Jim, my colleague and friend, and my doctoral supervisor at Queen's University, turned 90, and he died soon thereafter in April of this year. So in effect, what I'd like to be doing in this lecture is giving a dedication, dedicating this lecture to Jim's scholarship and his work, and I'll be talking about that work and then building upon it as his student, as his collaborator and co-author, and as his friend. When we're talking about anniversaries, we often think about our own lives, right? So how do we know who we are and what our lives mean? We often think about birthdays, our beginnings, and points of death in our families that give our lives and our families' lives meanings. It's trickier with groups. How do groups know who they are in those kinds of terms? When are groups like people, like James Thayer, born? When do they pass away? Can we even think in those kinds of terms? I'm going to be talking about cultural narratives today, and when it comes to Mennonites and Mennonite history, Mennonites this year are talking about 2025 as the 500th birthday of the Mennonite Peace Church tradition. And maybe because of that too, if there's a connection between Mennonites and Anabaptists and the Baptist tradition, maybe there's something like a 500th anniversary by extension to the Baptist tradition, of the Baptist tradition. That's a little bit trickier, maybe. I'm going to be talking today about this idea that the Mennonite tradition, the Anabaptist tradition, is 500 years old. And one of the big questions in the background of my talk is, what is Anabaptism exactly? I'll be talking about the stories that Mennonites tell about their past to help define who they are today. And I'll also, as a historian, be doing that thing that historians sometimes do, complicating straightforward, simple stories. In effect, I'm going to be talking about the invention of traditions. Now, the invention of tradition. At this point, I'm going to pause and note that there is an information sheet, and it's been passed around already. That's right, Carol Ann?
Yes, it has.
On the information sheet, I have included a reference to an important text for historians and cultural studies scholars. It's by Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger. They edited a volume in the 1980s called The Invention of Tradition, and that has been an extremely influential work. Also among historians of the Reformation and of the Renaissance. These two titles behind me on the screen are really smart books by really smart scholars. Peter Marshall, 1517, Martin Luther and the Invention of the Reformation. When did the Reformation begin? The basic story is on Halloween, the 31st of October, 1517, All Hallows Eve. When did the Renaissance begin? That's a little bit harder. Ada Palmer has just published a book this year, The Invention, or Inventing the Renaissance. Another really smart book, which gets us to wonder about these big labels, Reformation, Renaissance, and what do they mean? Today, perhaps in the closing thoughts particularly, or in the questions, we could talk about the invention of Anabaptism, because essentially that's what I'm going to be talking about today. How the idea of a tradition is created in debate, discussion, controversy, and storytelling, and anniversaries. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction in some short slides to Mennonite celebrations about the year 2025 as a birthday, in effect. That's a crude kind of term, but a birthday of Anabaptism. These are all marketing symbols for various groups of celebrations for the 500-year anniversary, 1525 to 2025. The Anabaptism at 500 is a group of Canadian and American Mennonite churches that are celebrating their history. There's also the Mennonite World Conference, which had its meeting in Zurich, Switzerland in May of this year with a big celebratory worship service and guests from the Catholic, Reformed, and Lutheran traditions. It was a big event. We also have some German groups. The Mennonite Historical Society in Germany has a 1525 to 2025 remembrance around the label gewagt, daring to believe, daring to love. There were all kinds of daring moments that each year German Mennonites in this marketing campaign were encouraged to think about. They called this the Anabaptist decade from 2015 to 2025. It was modeled on the Luther decade from 2007 to 2017. So there's a little bit of marketing competition going on. And then we can think about this in terms of a connection between the past. January 21st, 1525, the first baptisms of adult believers in Zurich, Switzerland. That's why that date of January 21 is so important. And I've colored this timeline, this arrow, with a rainbow color for a particular reason that will become clearer in just a moment and over the course of the talk. But this timeline gets complicated because 2025 is also the anniversary of the German Peasants' War. It was the biggest revolution in Europe before the French Revolution. It was a revolution in which about 300,000 people rose up in protest, and between 70 and 100,000 people died. Think about that in terms of, 500 years ago, almost 100,000 people being killed in battles. I'll tell you more about that over the course of the talk. I'm wearing a pin on my Patagonia jacket that is related to one of these marketing campaigns. Throughout Germany, in different states where the Peasants' War was particularly active, there are museum exhibits right now that display aspects of the Peasants' War, usually related to the local history. And they're usually not related to one another. There's not been a lot of coordination, and they usually don't have much connection with the Anabaptist anniversary at all either. So, is there a connection? Is it just a coincidence that the Peasants' War and Anabaptism emerged in the same year and are celebrated now? And my answer is not according to James Stayer. It's not my view either. I'm a student of Jim Stayer, and there should be a real deep connection between these two sets of celebrations, the celebration of the first baptisms of believers and the Peasants' War. So the hat is meant to symbolize that in a way. The hat I bought at the Bahalt Amish Mennonite Heritage Center in Millersburg, Ohio. I'll be talking more about that center later on in the talk. And the rainbow band, which you normally don't see on an Amish straw hat, is meant to be a reference to the Peasants' War veterans around the figure of Thomas Müntzer, a preacher who in Mennonite terms is considered a villain. And for Marxists in the later 20th century was considered a hero. So what is the connection between the rainbow band, which was meant to symbolize a covenant with God, and the peace church tradition of the Amish and the Mennonites? That's a question that I'll answer in various ways from various perspectives over the course of this talk. And I'll leave the hat to the side for the moment. and talk about the talk in outline. I'm going to start my talk with a topic that I'll introduce soon, but soon enough I'll be talking about the year 1525 in a way that highlights the fundamental interconnectedness of Anabaptism and the Peasants' War. In other words, the fundamental connectedness of a hero for the Mennonites, Conrad Grebel, and a hero for the Marxists, Thomas Müntzer. Two names that normally don't belong together, and I hope that I hope you'll learn a little bit more about both of these hero-villain figures and how they might be connected. In a third part of my talk, I'm going to give you a quick history of Mennonite memory culture in the period after the 16th century, starting in the late 16th century and going into the 19th and 20th century. And the question will be, how did Mennonites remember 1525, the year that's now the memorial year, in the past? The fourth, and not concluding, but highlight section of my talk, I hope, will be an introduction to two cycloramas, both created in the 1970s, one American, that's the place where I bought the straw hat, and one German. A cyclorama is a massive circular picture. Imagine this room painted on all sides, and it being a little rounded too. These cycloramas are something like that, but in a room that's many times bigger than this. Each of these cycloramas, one called Behalt in Millersburg, Ohio. Behalt means to maintain or preserve. And one in the German city of Bad Frankenhausen, present the year 1525 as the center point of these massive paintings, but in different kinds of ways, in ways that show a different memory culture related to the year 1525 and to the history of Anabaptism and the Peasants' War. But I'm going to start with some reflections about history, memory, and storytelling, and also about storytellers. And I'm going to start with a little bit of a twist as well. You normally don't see a historian citing a fantasy novelist for authority about history, but this quotation by Terry Pratchett, a novelist about an alternative world of theology and gods and imagination, is a fabulous way of thinking about history. Things just happen, one after another. But history is different. History has to be observed. Otherwise, it's not history. It's just, things happening one after another. And that, if you think about events that happen in your own life, even if you're not a historian, can make a lot of sense. How do we make sense of our lives with birthdays and other anniversaries and celebrations of death and memorials? Those are things that are not celebrated by professional historians, but all of us as historians of our own lives. Another historian, an actual historian, not a fantasy novelist, one of my favorite historians, John H. Arnold, who's now at the University of Cambridge. He's a medievalist, but he also reflects on the bigger history of history in a book called History, a very short introduction. John Arnold, in this wonderful book about what history is and how to think about it as history students, as history professors, or just as regular people trying to make sense of our own pasts, is with a few important thoughts. One basic thought: history, says John Arnold, is not the same thing as the past. It's a little bit like Terry Pratchett saying, things just happen. That's the past. History, says John Arnold, is a process. It's an argument, and it is composed of true stories about the past. And this idea of true stories is important for historians. We do have a storytelling flair that we try to develop so that students and readers pay attention to what we have to say, but we also have to get the story right. We can't just make things up like Terry Pratchett can about a world existing on the, as a disc on the back of a turtle. That's the Discworld stories of Terry Pratchett. Historians don't do that. They might write about Terry Pratchett's stories as because that's real stuff that happens. Stories can be the subject of historians. And historians do tell stories, but we've got to try to get the stories right. I'm going to be telling you about stories about the Anabaptist past. And with stories, it's not, you have to pay attention to the storytellers. If we don't pay attention to the storytellers, we're missing an important dimension of past stories. And, well, I'm going to introduce you a little bit to me. This is a picture, a selfie that I took in the little German town of Stolberg. Stolberg. It's in Saxony-Anhalt, a state in eastern Germany, up in the mountains. It's a little old mining town and a town that which had the right to mint coins. And that statue behind me is a statue, a modern statue of Thomas Müntzer. Stolberg is the town where Thomas Müntzer was born around the year 1490. Thomas Müntzer has been an important figure in my academic life, not because I've studied him particularly, but because my doctoral supervisor, James Stayer, made Thomas Müntzer one of the focuses of his scholarly life, and my dissertation supervisor in Germany, a friend of James Stayer, Hans-Jürgen Gertz, has written several biographies of Thomas Müntzer. Thomas Müntzer is something like a spirit that has been important in my professional life and in the life of East Germany as well. I've been anticipating this year, 2025, for a few reasons. I'll give you a little insight into my obsessions. Perhaps when I tell you that my cell phone number for the last 10 years or so ends in 1525. And I'm not the only historian of the Reformation who has a 1525 telephone number. 2025 is not just important for me, though, because of Reformation history. It's 100 years ago this year that my family left, well, one side of my family left Ukraine. If we had not left, my family might not now be on the front lines of the war, because my Opa's family came from the area around Melitopol, which is on the southern front lines, I believe, not too far from Crimea.
Yes.
So I'm very grateful to my family. I come from a Mennonite background. Another thing about me, I consider myself Mennonite. And what does that mean? Part of what I mean by that is that I am not a Mennonite. I'm not baptized. I'm not a member of a church. But I think I would spell Mennonite with an N-A-U-T at the end. So as an explorer in the cultural world of Mennonites, I'm a historian of Mennonites. As Mike Dennis said, particularly Dutch and Northern German Mennonites, over about 300 or 400 years. And I've been fascinated by 1525 enough also to be, well, I'm a bit of a contrarian sometimes. I like to think outside the box. One of the essays I've written recently, Mike, you announced it already, is called it's not about the year 1525, but about the year 1625. And how that year is really a more important year for Mennonites, I would say, to celebrate as an important point in which Mennonite identity started to crystallize as something unique, something cohesive, something that really had a subject worth celebrating. 1525, it seems to me, is an invented anniversary, and I'll get back to that. 2025 is also an important year for me, as I've already said, because my doctoral supervisor, co-author and friend, Jim Stayer, died this year. So one of the things that Jim said in his teaching is that Reformation historians today, whatever today is, have to think in terms of layers of storytelling and layers of history. We in the 21st century, if we're looking back on the Baptist or the Anabaptist past, have to think about ourselves interpreting people in the 19th century, interpreting people in the 17th century, 1625 perhaps, interpreting people in the Reformation era, interpreting the life of Jesus, and perhaps interpreting all of human history. If we have layers upon layers upon layers upon layers of stories. And what I might be doing today, in a way, is being contrarian enough to try to open up some of those storytelling layers. So that is a lesson I learned from Jim, to think about layers of history, and I hope to pass on that way of thinking about the past and thinking about Reformation history to you today. We're back at this busy slide. 2025 is a year full of museum exhibits about the Peasants' War and about early Anabaptism. It's a year full of conferences and worship services that look back to the beginning of Anabaptism. And this year, 1525, is haunted by a gigantic figure who's not always talked about, and that is this guy, Martin Luther. Now, what I'm showing you is a picture of Martin Luther from a little brochure. It's about size, it's even smaller than my hand. You can imagine taking a trip to Germany in 2016 or 2017 and getting this little brochure. It's a fold-out. So this is one side of the fold-out. It's in German, but if you flip it around, part of it is also in English. Here is a cultural narrative, a story that's supposed to give meaning and clarity about the past, a cultural narrative about the Reformation. If, as written in the Gospel according to John, in the very beginning was the Word, then the beginning of the Reformation was a thesis. More specifically, 95 theses, which Martin Luther published on October 31, 1517, and directed against the sale of indulgences, a lucrative business whereby the church exchanged remission of punishment for cash. The text reflected the spirit of the times, and enormous transformations took effect. Martin Luther and the Reformation changed Germany and the world, and that legacy is still to be seen. And then, an important line, discover the legacy of the Reformation in Destination Germany. This is a marketing brochure for tourism in German territories where Martin Luther played a big role. If you know a little bit about German history, this might be a little bit like following the trail of Goethe. Goethe slept here. Goethe woke up here. Goethe went on a picnic here. Martin Luther was here, there, and a lot of other places, and German states and towns made a big deal of that, not just in 2017, but for a decade before that, in the Luther decade that I've already mentioned briefly. Now, Martin Luther and this story of the Reformation is a cultural narrative that does give a lot of shape and meaning to the past for Lutheran church members, and for many historians too, who accept this story of Martin Luther, whose ideas, published in 1517, woke up Germany and Europe and the world and changed the history of Christianity and of Western civilization and the history of the world. You might guess what I think of this story. It's a great story. It's a fabulous story. It's a great marketing catchline, and it led to all kinds of museum exhibits. But it is a story with some little hiccups in it. So, now I'm going to be talking about Anabaptism and the Peasants' War in 1525. To understand James Stayer's view of the Peasants' War and its relationship to Anabaptism, it's helpful to know that Martin Luther associated the Peasants' War and Anabaptism. They were part of the same evil in Luther's view. And Thomas Müntzer, who was another preacher who had a connection with Wittenberg, Luther's town, was one of the most evil spirits. Luther, already in 1524, before the outbreak of the Peasants' War, published against the rebellious spirit Thomas Müntzer, in league with the devil. And when Müntzer was dead, killed by execution in May 1525, Luther and his allies did all that they could to raise up Müntzer's significance as an evildoer and one of the causes of the chaos and bloodshed of the so-called Peasants' War. So, Luther and and generations of Lutherans after him associated Thomas Müntzer as a demon figure. These two images that I have on the screen right now are not from the 16th century. The first one, the clearer one, that I have on the information sheet is from 1605, 1608. It's by an artist from Switzerland, I believe, but it was published in the Netherlands. And then republished and republished and republished, copied again and again. The second photo is of an engraving from around the year 1701, 1702. It's copied from the first, you can tell. And the copyist did not make it better. The image of Thomas Müntzer degraded over time, became more cartoon-like. Guess what? The image, the better image is the oldest image we have of Thomas Müntzer. We don't have any other image, none from his life. We don't know what he looked like. This is a fantasy image. And it's a fantasy image that looks kind of suspect, right? Probably inspired by Martin Luther. And this image is the kind of image that Mennonites had to deal with again and again over the course of the early modern era. Into the modern era, Mennonites, such as the Mennonite preacher and famous church historian Harold Bender, wanted nothing to do with the Lutheran picture of Anabaptists and their connection with the Peasants' War. According to Harold Bender, in a famous essay, The Anabaptist Vision, published in the later part of the Second World War, when Bender was the president of the American Church History Society, argued that true Anabaptists were pacifists, Christians, non-resistant Christians who rejected all kinds of violence. Instead, they looked back on the example of Jesus. They were disciples of Jesus who lived separate, peaceful lives. I have a quotation here from Bender's essay, which is helpful and striking. It's important for understanding Jim Stayer's work. Now, this is Bender in 1944 in the Anabaptist Vision. There is no longer any excuse for permitting our understanding of the distinct character of this genuine Anabaptism to be obscured by Thomas Müntzer and the Peasants' War, or any other aberration of Protestantism in the 16th century. According to Bender, there's a clear distinction to be made between genuine Anabaptists and the false, radical, rebellious spirits associated with Thomas Müntzer. Night and day, genuine Anabaptists and rebellious Anabaptists. Now, that's scholarship in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, an idea of Mennonite and Anabaptist history that dominated scholarship when James Stayer became a graduate student and did his research. And one of the questions that motivated him to look at the history of Anabaptism originally was this contrast between genuine Anabaptists on the one hand and false, rebellious Anabaptists who participated in the Peasants' War. Why so clear a distinction? They both defended the baptism of adult believers. Wasn't there? No? What's going on? Jim devoted 60 years of his life to looking at the scholarship, at the sources that he inherited from scholars like Harold Bender, but also the primary sources in archives in Germany, published in years since then. And Jim's view did not accept the Lutheran view that there was a connection between Anabaptism and the evils of the Peasants' War, and he didn't also accept the view of genuine Anabaptism as discussed by Harold Bender. Instead, he looked at the interconnectedness of an Anabaptism that's different than Anabaptism today, an Anabaptism that existed before the Mennonite ideal of non-resistance was actually crystallized. Here is an image on the screen of a peasant soldier carrying a flag with the word Freiheit on it. That's the German word for freedom. This is an image, actually not from the Peasants' War. It's from the year 1522 by a Catholic propagandist against Martin Luther called Thomas Murner. And what Murner and Luther's Catholic opponents were saying, or charging, is that Luther's claims to defend salvation by the word of God alone, to defend an ideal of Christian freedom, to defend a priesthood of all believers, with that kind of rebellious Lutheran preaching would lead to unrest and rebellion. That's even before the Peasants' War. Luther rejected this kind of an idea altogether. Now, Luther was a bit of a communications superstar for his day. He published pamphlets using the new technology of printing again and again. He knew how to use the new media of his day. Luther was a strong ego as well. How was he able to survive attacks from all kinds of opponents, including the allies of one of the strongest institutions of the time, the papacy, well, he had a strong sense of his self. Luther was a smooth political operator as well. He knew how to draw powerful political allies to him, and he knew how to really needle and sideline his opponents, often by giving them really bad names. And then, according to many Mennonite historians and some of Luther's contemporaries, Luther could also change his mind. He would support the idea that all of Christendom should be modeled on Scripture alone, and then Luther chickened out. I'm not trying to make a connection with anybody else here, but Luther was a disputed figure in his own day. And the idea now held by many Lutheran historians is that he defined the Reformation. The Reformation is what Martin Luther was, but there were many more voices of church reform in the 1510s, in the 1520s, even in the 15th century, and certainly in the year 1524 and 1525. It's those other voices that Jim Stayer has tried to highlight. And now, when we think about the year 1525, it's the year when we have the first baptisms in Zurich, but it's also around that time, from January 1525 until July 1525, when we have the height of what historians call the Peasants' War. It's sometimes called the German Peasants' War of 1525, but it wasn't really German, because Germany didn't exist. And it wasn't really a peasants' war, because the people who participated were many more people than peasants. There were noblemen and women who participated in the rebellion. There were lots of townsfolk, and peasants as a category is too vague to be able to describe the complex social network of the rebellion. As an alternative, historians sometimes talk about the Revolution of 1525, the biggest revolution, as I said before the French Revolution. And Jim Stayer would even call it the Commoners' Reformation. It was the expression, said Jim Stayer, of the Reformation in the countryside in 1525. Here is a map that might be a little bit small of the area that was affected by the rebellions. I'll try to expand this briefly. Now, my presenter's view is getting me mixed up a little bit here. There. So, we've got the dark red is the hot zones of the rebellion. And to give you a little bit of a sense of the geographical limitations, in the bottom of the map we've got the Adriatic Sea and the Venetian Republic, which was a separate political state, Lake Geneva on one side, and then the Swiss Confederation at another part of the map. This was a rebellion that began in late 1524, not with a war, but with protests by commoners who asked their social betters, the nobility and the clergy, who, you'll have to remember, in the 16th century, there were not citizens' rights. People were not equal before the law. Nobles had rights by birth to own land and sometimes own the work of people, serfs. And clergy, monasteries and convents were sometimes claiming noble rights as well, to own workers' rights, the work of serfs. So you could, as a farmer, be essentially close to a slave, to a clergyman, or to a nobleman, who would have separate legal rights to you, own so much more property when you could maybe own nothing. And in that world, in 1524, there were groups that rose up, as there had been cases of in the Middle Ages again and again and again, protesting for fair treatment by the nobility and the clergy. They were asking to be treated fairly. They were asking to have access to common lands, to farm and to fish. Lands that noblemen and women would sometimes claim as their own to be able to hunt freely on, and would chase away anybody else who claimed the land. This led to some really deep resentment, and groups would get band together, demand their rights, demand to be heard, demand to be treated fairly. This demand to be treated fairly in 1524 was mostly peaceful. It had a carnivalistic kind of feel to it, and it sometimes flared up in violence, but it wasn't really a war of peasants against the nobility. This is one thing that Jim emphasized again and again and again. It was more like a social protest movement, sometimes a tax revolt, refusal to pay tithes to noble and church institutions that didn't treat the commoners fairly. These were rights that the community demanded, and the community in German is called the Gemeinde. In German today, in Mennonite circles, congregation is sometimes called a Gemeinde. This connection between the community and the congregation was not so clearly separate in 1525. Communities were demanding rights to be treated fairly, and they were using the language of the Reformation, said Jim Stayer. The language that Martin Luther had advertised, but they were claiming their own independent right to be able to talk about the Word of God in their own terms, for their own interests and advantage, and for their own rights. Now, by March 1525, noble armies had gathered. They'd been gathering since late 1524 in anticipation of no longer treating these commoner bands of protesters that were spreading through the areas of light and dark red. No longer treating them peacefully, no longer negotiating with them, no longer listening to their demands, but rather eliminating any protests. There had been protests already in the 15th century. Nobles were used to the possibility of protest movements among the commoners, and the war that broke out was really a noble war against protest bands. Once the violence started to break out, violence and usually initiated by the noble police crackdown units, the commoner bands that were growing in numbers, with thousands and thousands of people as this movement spread, the commoner bands got more violent themselves in reaction. Professor Lindell Roper at Oxford University has got together a research group to look at the monasteries that the bands attacked and destroyed in the course of 1525. There were hundreds of monasteries that were looted. They were simple targets, usually unprotected, usually quite rich and wealthy. Usually monasteries claimed rights of ownership of labor or ownership of land, or the right to tax people in a way that many locals thought was unfair. So they were easy targets as these bands moved through the countryside, trying to gather more members. And as they moved from village to village, large groups, they needed provisions. And the monasteries, sometimes castles, were easy targets because they had lots of food and they were targets of resentment. Now, by April and May of 1525, noble armies were strong enough to run through Germany and attack these bands. Large groups of people who mostly stuck together, who had some military experience, were armed often, but who didn't have military discipline. And most of the deaths that occurred in the so-called German Peasants' War were the death of the so-called peasants, the commoners, who were just essentially cut down. One of the famous battles is the Battle of Frankenhausen in May 1525. Thomas Müntzer was a preacher who had helped gather a band in Thuringia together around him. They were inspired by the Word of God, like so many other Reformation preachers. They believed that God was a God of justice who worked for all Christians, not just for the fat nobility or the hypocritical preachers. They had seen a rainbow in the sky, apparently, and that rainbow was a sign, said Müntzer and his associates, of God's covenant with those who demanded fair treatment under the Gospels. But nonetheless, they were mowed down. Thomas Müntzer escaped, but was caught the next day in a nearby town, the town of Frankenhausen, and after 2 weeks he was executed in public and became a target of ridicule by Martin Luther and his associates. Now, that's May 1525. The first baptisms of adults did not take place under Thomas Müntzer's leadership. He was not an Anabaptist. He was an opponent of child baptism, because there's no example of child baptism in the Gospels. Like so many other Christians who had the ideal of salvation through the Word alone, and held the Bible up as a chief example of their model for their lives, baptism of children led to big questions. Many of Thomas Müntzer's associates and his supporters who survived the Peasants' War became Anabaptists. Jim Stayer has pointed out that there are about 40 or 50 later Anabaptists who became, who had been members of Thomas Müntzer's group.
Good. Yeah.
Good?
Close.
So I'll pause for just a moment here on the live stream. And how am I doing for time?
It's
What time is it right now?
it's almost 4.
It's almost 4.
Yeah, so
If I do another 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay,
it's good.
thanks. Thomas Müntzer and his associates, many of his associates became Anabaptists after the Peasants' War. What about the Zurich Anabaptists, the first Anabaptists? This is where I would recommend an article by James Stayer that I've put in the information sheet about Anabaptism and the Peasants' War in 1524 and 1525. And in that essay, published in the Mennonite Quarterly Review, Jim talks about the really close connections between Conrad Grebel and his circle and the early Peasants' War. Rather than being a separate movement, the first baptizers of adults, from the Peasants' War, what we find, says Jim Stayer, is actually Anabaptism emerging from the cultural niche of the peasant movements. The first baptizers of adults were defended by armed bands. The biggest theologian, the most important theologian of adult baptism in 1524 and 1525 was Balthasar Hubmaier, and he was a supporter of a broad Baptist Reformation in towns like Waldshut, where he was a preacher, and throughout the Swiss Confederation, including in Zurich. Ulrich Zwingli, who opposed adult baptism in 1525, had originally been a supporter of adult baptism, but like Luther, he chickened out on some of his earlier theological positions, and the Anabaptists were those who stuck to what they understood as the biblical model of baptisms, even in the midst of conflict, trying to convert whole villages to the adult baptizing cause, says James Stayer. It's an article that's not too long. I would recommend it. But the point of Jim's work over lots of years was to point out that Anabaptism grew out of the tradition of, or the conflicts of the Peasant War, and only afterwards, in the shock and horror of the violence of the Peasants' War, did Anabaptists define themselves as a peace church. That distinction between genuine peaceful Anabaptists and violent rebellious Anabaptists is only a distinction that makes sense after the fact, in the layers of interpretation. I'll quickly now talk about how Mennonites remembered 1525 in past centuries. This is a chart that I put together for the essay 1625 about the memory of Dutch Anabaptist culture in the early modern period. This is a chart based on publications from that are collected in the bibliography of Anabaptism and the Mennonite bibliography. What it shows is that while the Anabaptist traditions were largely Germanic in their language focus in the 1520s and 30s, that linguistic focus shifted to a Dutch focus in Anabaptist publications. In most of the rest of the early modern period, at least until 1700, when I stopped my gathering of data, the Netherlands became the center of Mennonite culture throughout the early modern period, not Germany. Germany had been the center of a crackdown. Starting with 1525, there were edicts again and again and again in the Holy Roman Empire. Not in Germany, it didn't exist, but in 1529 there's a famous edict that's published to make the baptism of adults a crime punishable by death. For that reason, Mennonites wanted nothing to do with Anabaptism. Mennonites were not Anabaptists. That was the way they defined themselves throughout most of their history. Anabaptist in German is translated as Wiedertäufer, and to be a Wiedertäufer in law until 1806, when the German Empire disintegrated, that was a capital crime. It was usually not, the crime of adult baptism was usually not punished with death after the 16th century, but that the wave of persecution in German territories chased most supporters of adult baptism to the peripheries of the empire, either to Moravia and Bohemia, the area that Gerald Zeman studied, or to the Dutch Republic. And in one of the most famous Dutch publications of the early modern period, the Martyr's Mirror, I have looked for mentions of Conrad Grebel and the first baptisms in Zurich, and I find nothing. Mennonites, for most of their history, did not think that 1525 was a year to celebrate. 1525, in the Mennonite imagination, until the 19th century, was a year of tragedy. It was the year of the Peasants' War and of Thomas Müntzer. That was a year that was defined in propaganda and in storytelling by Martin Luther, other Lutherans, and by supporters of the same noble armies and their successors that had successfully murdered thousands, tens of thousands of people. So the category, the German Peasants' War, the idea that Anabaptists were criminals is part of a massive propaganda campaign codified in Lutheran and in Catholic theology and in official storytelling for hundreds of years. Mennonites in the early modern period didn't celebrate 1525 as the beginning of the Mennonite tradition. Rather, they celebrated the year 1536, which in the Mennonite tradition was the year when Simons left the Catholic priesthood. That's also a story. It's not clear that that's what Menno in fact did. But in 1736, Mennonites commissioned a Lutheran medallion maker to mint a coin, a memorial coin, to the 200th anniversary of Menno Simons' departure from the Catholic Church. And this is an illustration from 1742 of that coin. That's probably the first big Mennonite anniversary, and it was shaped by Lutheran celebrations of Martin Luther. Mennonites wanted to have their own more authentic celebration of true gospel revival. One of the big points of memory culture in Reformation history is really not the 16th century and 1517. 1517 really only became a big year that is worth celebrating and is defining in world history in the era of German nationalism and Romanticism. Romanticism, a movement that celebrates heroes. And German Lutherans thought that the hero, one of the big heroes who should be celebrated in German history, was Martin Luther. In the 19th century, there were a whole series of big statues to Martin Luther that popped up across the country. This is the oldest one in the city of Wittenberg. It was created quite early in 1821, before the new modern German state was formed, but most of these statues date from after 1870, when Germany was formed as a nation state. These statues are big metal monuments to say, hey, Germans, especially you Catholics, watch out. This is the figure of great world historical significance who is dominating the history of our nation, who has forged our great Germanic culture, Martin Luther. And Mennonites would look to this and scratch their heads. Mennonites were mostly Dutch at this time, although there was a Germanic Mennonite population that felt also connected to the new German nation. But Dutch Mennonites were feeling a moment of decline. What's going on? Mennonites wanted their own historical hero. And it's around this time, in the 19th century, when historians discovered the Hutterite Chronicles, which had been a document available only in manuscript form, available only to a small group of Hutterites. This is the oldest document. This is something that James Stayer outlines in his lecture on the importance of Gerald Zeman's scholarship. And the Hutterite Chronicles, well, they were they include the only record of the first baptisms in 1521. And then all of a sudden, Mennonites, German Mennonites, could point not to the Netherlands as a starting point of Mennonites, and not to Germany, but to Switzerland, a unique place outside the militaristic new German nation. Became particularly important in the 20th century with the rise of Nazism to have a hero, Conrad Grebel, who was a pacifist and not a German, but Germanic. And so that's why then the modern idea of Anabaptism with pacifist roots in 1525 is really an idea from the 19th century. Now, in just a few minutes, I'll point to, if I have 5 more minutes, I will point to some 20th century post-war memories of these layers of celebration and remembrance. I've already told you about Harold Bender and his definition of Anabaptism, or his redefinition of Anabaptism, so that Mennonites could celebrate roots that were called Anabaptist roots. It's difficult in English to talk about these early roots of the adult baptizing traditions because what do we call them? Baptists? That's, as you know, at the Acadia Centre, the distinction between Baptists and Anabaptists is a tricky one. There are connections, or are there connections, and what are they? To talk about a group, a historical group that is not Baptist, but still baptizes adults, well, that now it's common in English to talk about Anabaptists, but that's the Old English term for Wiedertäufer, and Wiedertäufer is the term that is that defined Anabaptism as illegal in early modern law. I'll talk now about 2 cycloramas. Mennonites now think about the Anabaptist tradition not as something separate from them, but as part of their history, as long as it's the right kind of Anabaptists. This is celebrated, this tradition of celebrating the true tradition of Anabaptism is this, the purpose of the Bahalt, or the Bahalt Amish Mennonite Heritage Center in Millersburg, Ohio. This is one of the beginning frames of that huge painting. It is a painting that is 10 feet high. Imagine this, 10 feet high, 256 feet long in a huge round room. It was created by a German who moved to Canada originally and then discovered the Amish in trips from Ontario to Ohio and Pennsylvania. He fell in love with Amish culture and the story of the Mennonites and the Amish. He wasn't from that tradition himself. His name was Heinz Gaugel, but he steeped himself for a bunch of years in Amish and Mennonite history, and on that basis created this image that starts with Jesus and the apostles as the originator of true Christian history and goes through the Middle Ages and then highlights here, this is another frame, highlights the first baptisms of George Blaurock by Conrad Grebel in Zurich on January 21, 1525. And it also highlights, among other things, conflicts among the early Anabaptists that emerged out of the Peasants' War. Conflicts such as conflicts between Hans Hut, who is in the red frame here. He's holding a staff. And Balthasar Hubmeier, he's holding a sword, putting it into a sheath. That's supposed to be an episode in the late 1520s, after the Peasants' War, where some Anabaptist leaders were arguing about whether true Christians could be able to hold the authority of the magistrate or had to be peaceful. Hans Hut was a representative in this picture of peaceful, non-resistant Anabaptists. And that's worth thinking about just for a moment, because I'll show you a second big art piece, and that is the Bad Frankenhaus Panorama Museum. It's a cyclorama that's even bigger than the Ohio cyclorama. It's in Bad Frankenhausen, Germany. Its dimensions are 46 feet high and 404 feet around. It is an awesome piece. For my research for this talk, I visited both places, and it is really quite striking. I have a foldout of the entire thing that I could show you after the talk if you're interested. It was created by an East German Marxist artist, Werner Tübke, at the same time as Heinz Gaugel was painting his painting of the Amish Mennonite tradition. It took Tübke about 2 decades to finish his work of art, and, interesting fun fact, it was opened almost 36 years ago today, for the first time to the public, on September 14th, 1989, which is an interesting date if you know your 20th century history, because it was only a few months later when East Germany collapsed as a Marxist state. Now, this painting is not a simple Marxist account of history, but it places Thomas Müntzer, who's the figure in the black here, at the center of the story. And that is the museum on the hill where the Battle of Frankenhausen was supposed to have taken place, where it did in fact take place. There's archaeological evidence of this. It's well documented. That is a huge building, and that's one of my pictures while I was walking up to this place this past June. Here is a screenshot from the web page of this museum, and I'll zoom in on it. There's Tübke's representation of the rainbow, which was supposed to be God's covenant with the commoners who went into battle. It wasn't really a battle, it was a massacre. Thomas Müntzer didn't die, but he didn't survive much longer. I'm going to point your attention to this fountain with Luther roses in it. And we have the image of Martin Luther right here. Several other key figures from the era of the Reformation, including Desiderius Erasmus. And here we have Hans Hut, who also shows up in the Millersburg cyclorama in Ohio. Here we have Hans Hut not carrying a staff, but carrying a sword. In this image, a Marxist image, and why a Marxist image? Well, for Marxists, not Martin Luther, but Thomas Müntzer was considered a hero because Marx and Engels had built up Thomas Müntzer as a preacher of early bourgeois revolution. Their idea was that, yes, theology is a mirage, but it was the language of the 16th century, and Thomas Müntzer spoke that language better than anybody else to understand the sufferings of the proletariat and the commoners. Here we have an imagination of Hans Hut. In the other image, we have an imagination of Hans Hut as well. This is the one link between the two big remembrances of 1525 in the 1970s. And they're different kinds of images. One of a peaceful preacher and the other of a peasants' war sympathizer and ally of Thomas Müntzer. It was Hans Hut who, in his interrogation under torture, recorded the story of the rainbows that were supposed to have been seen in 1525 by Thomas Müntzer as a sign of hope. Hut became an Anabaptist after the Battle of Frankenhausen, and became a supporter in many ways of a peaceful form of Anabaptism. It's a complicated kind of peacefulness, because he was also an apocalyptic preacher. But in these two images, we have different storytelling traditions, different anniversary traditions, and different traditions of remembrance, and different ways of thinking about defining and reinventing Anabaptism again and again and again. So, I would like to thank you for your attention. Hello to everybody out there in digital land. And I hope I've sparked some questions or some ideas, and I'd be happy to chat some more.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was really fascinating. This whole raises questions about historical memory, for me, and the way in which decisive historical periods are recalled, remembered. And what was coming to mind for me was the American experience, the reinvention of the lost cause, right? The American South as being, genteel, if you will, about sort of the uplift of African Americans and a sort of qualitatively better society. And the monuments started showing up, in the 1890s and early 20th century, at the same time the segregation is being solidified, crystallized. Fascinating questions being raised. Open it up to the floor then. Questions for Professor Driedger. Questions about this thought-provoking lecture, thought-provoking address about tradition.
Yeah, in a way, we have the 150th anniversary of 1525 as the beginning of Anabaptism.
Mm-hmm.
The lost, I don't want to draw too much of a connection between the lost cause and the Confederate tradition of memory and the Lutheran tradition of memory, but it's really quite striking how frequently in the 19th century and the early 20th century, we've got different memory cultures working so hard to create monuments.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. Question? Yeah.
I mean, this is an interesting, I don't know if this is going to make any sense, but I think people in the 19th century, in the Romantic era, I'm Adam Driedger, by the way,
Right.
and they're building monuments, they're building statues because for the Romantics, it's about great people, it's about culture, nations are real, but it's also about the physical, right? You've got to be able to locate your Germanness comes from the land, and it has to be something in that land. So my question is sort of, you mentioned talking about sort of events that we do not observe. To what extent are some of these, in the Anabaptist tradition, or sort of more broadly, are these about using history to say not just this event happened, but this event, to talk about physicality? The rainbow was really there, and what counts if you're going to believe in Anabaptism is that there was that rainbow.
Yeah, the rainbow is not so much a symbol for Mennonites. It's a symbol for those who want to raise Thomas Müntzer up as a hero, and those are mostly Marxists in the 20th century. Now, in the 21st century, the rainbow has become a marketing image for museums and tourism offices, mostly in East Germany, where Thomas Müntzer was active, who are, in some cases, doing fabulous exhibits. The city of Mühlhausen in the state of Thuringia has 5 different museums in a relatively small city, bigger than Wolfville, but that's not hard, I guess, and bigger than St. Catherine's, which is also not so hard, but in the city of Mühlhausen, where Thomas Müntzer had been a preacher for a while, there is one of the best exhibits I've seen about the Peasants' War in all its complexity. And there, the rainbow image comes up. For Mennonites now, the rainbow image is associated with, like for all of us, equal rights, especially gay and lesbian rights, but also a welcoming flag for everybody. And some of the advertising for the Peasants' War, which locates the rainbow image, particularly in Thuringian history, so a place, also tries to then draw some modern connections. Thomas Müntzer and the peasants were fighting for freedom. The button I'm wearing right now says Freedom 1525. That's a marketing button for the Mühlhausen Thuringian museums. And the idea of freedom, and the commoners of 1525 and LGBT rights, that is one connection of the world of 1525 and the modern world that some marketers and historians are drawing. And some Anabaptists would draw that too. There are Mennonites who are very much in favor of an open, inclusive church. The image of, or the memory of Thomas Müntzer is problematic for Mennonites still because so strongly ingrained in the Mennonite story is this idea that's founded in the propaganda of Martin Luther that Thomas Müntzer was an evil person, an evil rebel. And this is such a deep part of Mennonite storytelling, Mennonite history, that it's hard to shake.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question. I thought it was really, really interesting hearing you talk about the pacifism of Anabaptists as a later development, whether that was in the generation after, immediately after.
It's even the years immediately after.
Immediately after. And so I don't know where, just to clarify, Steyer's argument comes in, if it's immediately after or if it was the 19th century.
So Jim Steyer talked about the cultures and the complexities of the world of the 1520s and the 1530s particularly. And then he also did some work on the 19th and 20th century, particularly German Lutheran historians. One of the titles that I have on the information sheet is Martin Luther, German Savior, which is about 20th century proto-Nazi views of Martin Luther. You might know or you might not know, Jim came from an Anabaptist background, but he converted to Judaism. And he was very sensitive to Nazi persecution and the relationship between persecuted Jews and persecuted Anabaptists. But Jim didn't look at so much the time between the 16th century and the 20th century. That's my unique perspective. Jim didn't focus so much on Dutch history either. In his Zeman lecture, he mused out loud about the question, which was more important for the survival of Anabaptism? The Hutterite traditions in Bohemia and Moravia, or the Mennonite Dutch traditions in the north? For me, the answer is clear. It was the Dutch. That was the center of Anabaptist public, international, diplomatic culture. The Dutch were incredibly rich. The 17th century was the Dutch golden age because it was a place of so much money. And Mennonites, Dutch Mennonites, used a lot of that money to help adult baptizers around Europe, in Bohemia and Moravia, in persecuted adult baptizers in Switzerland, persecuted adult baptizers throughout the German lands. Without the rich worldly Mennonites, the Mennonite tradition, the Anabaptist tradition, might not have survived as long as it did.
And how was that, not all of that you just said, but the argument that the pacifism comes later, that wasn't that either the pure, genuine Anabaptist or it's out of the 19th century. How is that received? How's that been received by Mennonite historians? Because he's overturning Bender's argument.
Yeah.
Do Mennonite historians to say, oh yeah, that's right, or are they pushing back saying no?
Yeah. The answer is a little complicated. So Jim didn't say that pacifism came later. He does recognize that there were very loud and clear voices in favor of Christian nonviolence and pacifism in the earliest days, and Conrad Grebel was one of those voices. There's a famous letter between Conrad Grebel addressed to Thomas Müntzer in 1524, September 1524, so exactly 501 years ago this month. And in that letter, Conrad Grebel recommends to Thomas Müntzer that he followed the Gospels in a nonviolent way. This was a discussion among people who actually recognized their brotherhood, because Conrad Grebel talked to Thomas Müntzer as a brother. It's not clear that Thomas Müntzer ever received the letter. It's also not clear that he would have changed his mind if he had. But what is clear, according to Jim Steyer, is that preachers who advocated for the community rights, the authority of the gospel, and baptism of adult believers, and for pacifism, were often defended by men in arms who were also Anabaptists, who accepted the adult baptism as a true baptism, and were not, and sometimes were soldiers and were not shy to use arms. And the pacifist baptizers did not distinguish themselves in 1525 from their arms-bearing compatriots. Now, that's a view
I
that.
don't want to take over I know there are some other questions, but I really appreciate that.
If I could take 2 more minutes, I'll just, several other lecturers in this series have addressed this issue. John Roth, I believe, has spoken in this series, and if John is listening, he can perhaps correct me, but he recognizes the complexity of this question of violence and nonviolence in the first years of Anabaptism. As does Arnold Snyder, another key Mennonite historian. One of the opponents of Jim Stayer's views and of Arnold Snyder's view about the connectedness of the Peasants' War, veterans, and Anabaptism is another lecturer, but I think in the Rollick series, Andrea Strubent. She's a Baptist historian who's written a book claiming that Conrad Grable and his circle were absolutely separate from the Peasants' War men in arms who accepted baptism. She's a defender of the Bender position. And I've never had a chance to meet her and talk with her about this. I'd love to do that sometime, but she and Jim Stayer have debated this question in the Mennonite Quarterly Review.
We'll just have time for one more question.
Yeah, so a question from online. We've had about 14 viewers watching online. One of the groups actually is Hannah Lane in a crowd at Mount Allison University, including someone named Trudy Tattersall, who you know from Brock.
I know Trudy well. Yes, hi Trudy.
The question actually comes from Gary Waite, however. And he says, Mike, thanks for the fascinating conversation. So how do you suggest that Dutch Mennonites should remember the year of 1535, the fall of the Anabaptist Munster? Should they just ignore it?
So there's another anniversary that's coming up in 10 years. There was a period after the Peasants' War, 1525, when Anabaptism, a group of Anabaptists were elected to the city council of a city in Westphalia close to the Dutch borderlands, the city of Münster. Not to be confused with Munster. We have Thomas Munster, a Peasants' War leader of 1525, and the city of Münster. Gary and I have talked about this topic again and again. One of the issues for celebrations of, or thinking about Anabaptist history will be how to commemorate the period of Anabaptist rule in Münster, because while Thomas Munster has been vilified by generations of Lutherans and also generations of Mennonites who accepted the Lutheran defamation of the memory of Thomas Munster, there's no later group like the Marxists, no Marxist historians who took up the cause of the memory of the Anabaptists at Münster, who have been vilified to no end. Propaganda story upon propaganda story. How should Mennonites remember the period of Anabaptist rule in Münster? By remembering what Gary and I have studied for a whole lot of years of our professional life, and that is how hate literature from the past gets sort of washed like dirty money through historical retelling. Hate literature often gets transformed into historiography, and the story that we have of Anabaptist Münster is a story that looks like it's history of what actually happened, but what we really have is a story told by modern historians borrowing from Reformation era hate propagandists. So Gary knows this kind of a subject well because he gave his lecture in this series on that kind of a topic, the way Anabaptists were remembered in 16th and 17th century English hate literature. So, hi Gary.
Well, once again, join me in thanking Professor Driedger for this fantastic and thought-provoking lecture. Thank you.